Joe MacKenzie here, your watercolor coach. Today we're going to talk about permanent alizarin crimson, another color that has to be on my palette and maybe on yours too. Here we go. All right, so let's look at alizarin crimson for a minute. Let's look at it right from the tube. First of all, this is permanent alizarin crimson, and that means when you go to buy it, it is helpful to buy the permanent because it is not as fugitive as the ones that aren't permanent, so that a year from now, where you put red, you'll still see red. It will dry lighter than it appears here. That's true of all watercolor, but especially the reds. So here's a alizarin crimson with a little bit of water added each time, which will change the value somewhat, although I strongly suggest that you don't use value to get to the color you want. It's fairly transparent. The next color I'm putting is the other reds on my palette. There's a cadmium red, which is on the left going vertically, and then a permanent rose going vertically, and then alizarin crimson on the farthest right going vertically. I want you to be able to see the three reds that are on my palette and how they vary in terms of how dark or light they are. And you can see through the value finder that cadmium red, the furthest one on the left, is lighter than the rose, which is in the middle, and is still lighter than the alizarin crimson. And that's why I call alizarin crimson a dark red. It's a dark red relative to other reds. It's not dark compared to other colors, like a blue, for example, but compared to reds it is. The other way, if you don't have a value finder, is you can use one of these value scales and you match up the notches and then can identify your color values according to number. Why does this matter? Well, let's say that you're going to be painting someone's face, a Caucasian person's face, and so you're going to be really investigating the mid-tone values of red. This is red. This is alizarin crimson with a little bit of Naples yellow added to it. This is cadmium red with a little bit of Naples yellow added to it. And the next is going to be alizarin crimson on its own. And you can see the value differences. And then the reason that I'm bringing this up is because now I want to tip red even more, so it will be a darker value than the alizarin crimson is when it comes out of the tube. I've tipped it, but what's important here is that it's still a red. And if I tip it too much, by adding more blue to it, I will indeed get a dark color, but it's going to be harsh looking on a face. So this is how to really have gradated color and to plan for it. And I almost call this like safe cracking. All right, so you can see there how dark that number 4 is, which is alizarin crimson with a little bit of ultramarine blue in it. But it's still a red. It's still a reddish. You wouldn't call that blue yet. It's definitely a darker red than alizarin crimson is on its own. So let's see what happens when we put more blue into it. Okay, now it's tipped over. You would really call that a purple because it's not a red anymore. And what value is that? Well, let's take a look. Okay, that's a number 5, so it's a little bit darker. So when I'm working on the face, I want to be really careful about staying in the 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. It isn't until the very, very end that I'm going to get involved in something that's a number 5. Otherwise, my different shapes are going to be too harsh. And I really want to have that gradation on, say, a face, or you might find it on a flower petal. You want to have that gentle gradation so that your painting still has a lot of hue in it and a lot of boldness of color and brightness, but that doesn't tip over into harshness, where there's a big leap from one value to another. So let's take a look at how this would play out if it was a painting of a red apple. Right, so this is completely, let's call it a red delicious apple, completely red apple. So the challenge here is to find a value range, but using reds to get there. Right, so that is probably alizarin crimson on its own. And that's for the dark side of the apple, because remember I said that that was a dark red. And there's the shadow. That gets into adding a little bit of blue to it, but it's still a reddish blue. There's the cadmium red, which is definitely lighter. But these are still gradations of red, and there's the Naples yellow with some cadmium red in it. And you can see there's a gentle transition happening. So that's gentle transition on the apple, and you would have a gentle transition on the face. It's just a gentler way of going about looking at color and color value and how to dial in where you want to be, but not using water to get there. We didn't use water to make number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, or number 5. We mixed color in order to do that. And when you do that, it allows your painting to still be very vibrant and not look like it was put in the wash 100 times. Now I dried that apple purposely so you could see how much lighter the color is. Red often requires a second pass, and so that's what I'm doing here. Doing the exact same thing that I did before, but putting a second coat. But it has to be dry in order to do this. Otherwise, you will not get a vibrancy of color. Everything will become dulled down. Right, and now if there's something that I really want to emphasize as being dark, I will put in a darker moment, maybe something that is a purple, just a darker moment. But I've controlled for red along the way. So that's a strategic way of going about looking at a red form and finding volume by mixing using alizarin crimson and then the other reds as well, using a minimum amount of water in order to get to the value that you want to get to. So you would do this, let's say if you had a red barn, you would do it, oh, I wanted to put this is the ultramarine blue coming in, just so that you can see the value of the ultramarine blue is going to be a 5. But if I had used that instead of the number 4 on the side of the apple, you could see how that wouldn't read as an apple anymore. It would be slightly off. It's not just that the value would be correct, but you wouldn't have that gradation of red. It would be too harsh looking. So 5 and 5 are the same there, but there's something more pleasing to the eye when there is this sort of ombre effect on a form. And you see that on forms all the time when you observe them. So that is why permanent alizarin crimson is super important to me, why I have to have it on my palette. I also did an earlier video on ultramarine blue, a must-have on my palette. The next color I'm going to cover is going to be Aurelian, which is not a very well-known or used color, but it's essential on my palette. And if I was on a desert island and could only use 3 colors for the rest of my life, I would use ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and Aurelian. So remember to keep the whites of your paper white, your paints wet, match for value, mix for color, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.